and talked about the origins of the charter movement and about their work in schools that we all thought were emblematic of the ideals and principles behind that movement. Together, with John Merrow moderating, we drafted and adopted a resolution, which stated, students, families, educators, and indeed the entire country need a national, independent, democratically organized group to advocate for independently managed, financially transparent, community-oriented public charter schools as articulated in our statement of principles. That was a mouthful, but it passed unanimously, as did the statement of principles. So subsequently, we put together a committee and started the work that led to the incorporation of CPICS in 2018. Last year, about this very same time, we had a knock your socks off in-person symposium in Albuquerque that really showcased the amazing things that school leaders, teachers, and kids can do when they are given the autonomy to do so. It was a joyful gathering. Best education conference ever was a refrain we heard from so many. But looking back, that joy was as fleeting as the joy that most of us, or I truly want to believe all of us here, felt when a new president-elect was announced on Saturday, November 7th, 2020 at 11:30 Eastern Time, only to experience the agony of having it quashed within 24 hours and then tossed back into the abyss. So the joy of something greater than ourselves, and then back to the pain of polarization and disinformation. It was the same feeling returning from the euphoria of our meeting in Albuquerque, returning to the pain of people in the educational arena, once again tearing themselves to shreds over which schools are truly public or which schools are truly outperforming other schools. Until I stepped away from my role as CPICS director back in May to take over the reins of Academy of the City Charter School in Queens, I spent a lot of my waking time trying to figure out how to forge an agreement between the warring sides in public education. People who were mainly fighting over the definition of choice, which had now become a thoroughly weaponized word, and trying to figure out how we had gotten to where we were and why we all kept digging ourselves deeper holes. So I'm going to confess, this work often turned me into a crank. I got annoyed at network schools, and I saw them completely at odds with the autonomy of the original charter agreement and the autonomy that charters were supposed to have, and found that the teacher burnout at many of them was predictable and horrifying. I got thoroughly annoyed at the rants of people who should know better, but refused to acknowledge that many of the schools we ran, especially the independent community-based charter schools, were great examples of the democracy and teacher empowerment that they all preached in action. Their attitude, in fact, reeked of jealousy over our autonomy. I got annoyed at the philanthropists who were pushing and funding charter expansion because many of them are also working against a larger progressive vision in education and society. I had no idea what we were doing with them. I got annoyed when teacher unions fought against reimbursement at our state legislature in New York, even though a bunch of schools, mine included, had collective bargaining agreements. These guys were in fact advocating against the interests of their own teachers. I got annoyed at our narrow test-based accountability that was increasingly out of touch with present-day reality, yet still largely embraced by charter advocates because it was a game that they played very well. My head started to explode when I saw the words high performing in front of charter school, because it was just a code for kids who rock the standardized tests. Certainly not a bad thing in and of itself, but something that ultimately twists what a good liberal education should all be about. So I became a crank, and I took shots at everyone. And in turn, I thoroughly annoyed a good many people myself. But still, Up until the time I stepped away and back into a school, I was a crank chasing a vision. That fight among education advocates was pointless and pathetic. And the fight was almost entirely between people who saw themselves as progressives. Yeah, there were some libertarians thrown in, and maybe some dowdy old cardigan wearing movement conservatives from the American Enterprise Institute, but education advocacy was and still is largely a liberal's playground. And this fight is chewing up people who have far more agreements than disagreements, and far more agreements on things that might be considered basic principles around public education. So it was with that idea that I got together with my friend and mentor, Debbie Meyer, to see if we could strike up a dialogue in a small group of people representing charters, pedagogy, education research, and labor, and maybe hash some of this stuff out. We agreed to keep our talks quiet in order to avoid the wrath of our own partisans, and this turned out to be a very good idea. So for those of you who don't know Deb Meyer, back in 1974, she was one of the leaders of a small band of insurrectionists working within the New York City DOE, who managed to wrest a tremendous degree of autonomy for a group of public schools in East Harlem. Deborah was the founding principal of Central Park East, which became a citadel of progressive education in the Dewey tradition and remained so for over 40 years, until just a few years ago, when the DOE ultimately, in its tremendous wisdom, decided to reel it back into mediocrity. 20 years after founding Central Park East, Debbie did it again by opening up the Mission Hill School in Boston, again as an autonomous district-run school, but this time with a focus on democratic decision-making at the school and classroom levels, and a curricular focus on what they call democratic habits of mind. Oh, think about that for a minute. Democratic habits of mind. That should have some particular resonance right now. So one of the reasons I bring up Deb's history is because the DNA of chartering runs straight through to the work that she and others pioneered almost 50 years ago. And that work was grounded in the inextricable relationship between democracy and education. Do I sound like Dewey? I hope so. Deb and I thought we could get somewhere and strike a grand bargain that would put an end to the ed wars. So when I became friends with Deb, my crankiness gave way to her optimism. The truth is that there is no way to be around Deb and not be taken in by that optimism. But we also had some reason to hope for a rapprochement between labor and chartering, because there were many examples of peaceful coexistence in a number of states. I'm going to describe one, although I guess in 2020, you may look back and think that this is ancient history, but it's interesting ancient history worth thinking about. Amber Charter School was founded in 2000, which made it one of the very first charter schools in New York City. And it was also the first Latino-led charter school in New York State. Its founding board chair was Luis Miranda, who's a highly successful political consultant, and the guy's a Renaissance man who is now much better known as the father of Lin-Manuel Miranda. Luis engaged directly with Randy Weingarten, who was then the president of the UFT. And they, just the two of them, negotiated the very first skinny labor contract in New York City. Now, skinny means, in the sense that this contract was a bare 30 pages compared to the phone book-sized contract that the UFT has with New York City. Luis was rightfully proud of this accomplishment. He felt it gave him the best of both worlds. It was not overly prescriptive, so his principal had the authority to run an innovative school, and his teachers had job security and thus might be expected to stick around. So 20 years later, Amber 1 and now Amber 2 are still going strong, and teacher retention is still high. I'm going to dwell a few minutes on this teacher retention piece because I think it's important. The notion of who and what a teacher is has undergone a slow and yet very radical change over the past decade. Most of us, I suspect, are where we are because at some point in our lives, we were inspired by a teacher, or if we were really lucky, we were inspired by several. And these teachers were very likely to have spent years or their entire lifetimes in their career. My personal teacher hero was Jess Waggis. He was my high school Spanish teacher. Jess traveled every summer, and then he came back and he regaled us with stories, poems, and songs, and his accordion, which I still remember. It's 55 years later now, and I can still sing those songs. I'm pretty sure he kept on teaching until he was in his 70s, and then I hear he retired in Valencia. This was his lifelong endeavor. And because of him, my Spanish is pretty good for a gringo. This is not the definition, though, that we see in so many definition of teacher that we see in so many, quote, high-performing schools and networks. The role of teacher there has become to improve student outcomes, meaning test scores. And their success in doing so is measured by value-added metrics, essentially the degree to which they can improve test scores over time. So new teachers are given a great deal of training in classroom management, not a bad thing, and in the science of raising test scores. And by science, I mean they do have a methodology and they do have the data to back it up. So as much as I find fault in this definition of educator, I do not doubt for one moment its efficacy. If, in fact, you focus hard enough on the end result you want, you stand a pretty good chance of getting there. Back in the day, the early days of chartering, and maybe even now, there was a great deal of fondness for the words relentless and urgency when talking about our schools. We should be relentless in our focus on the bottom line of the enterprise, and everyone, especially those on governing boards, should feel the urgency of getting to that bottom line. The result is that way too many teachers are essentially technicians and on a burnout path to a career change in 3 years. And not nearly enough are on track to become career educators in the sense that we knew what career educators were. If this is the trajectory of the teaching profession, we are all going to suffer. But I digress. Deb and I were out to save the world, and still are out to save the world because the moment is past due for educators to bury their freaking hatchets and coalesce around their points of agreement. Because if we cannot do that in our neck of the woods, then there is little hope for the rest of the nation to heal from its present nightmare. So our group met on and off over the course of the year. And in the spring of 2019, we thought we were getting close to an agreement on a set of principles that we could all subscribe to. I'm going to read a short draft of these principles to you now. But before I do, it's really important that you not see these points as prescriptions for charter schools. What I'm reading are points that are meant for all publicly funded schools. So here's what we got. Public schools are publicly funded with these funds equitably distributed among all schools, but with a major focus on students who have been disadvantaged. Public schools are democratically and transparently governed. Public schools are operated as a public trust on a not-for-profit basis and are not exploited for personal benefit or private advantage. Public schools educate all students, integrating different races, classes, and faith communities, and serve fully high-needs students. Public schools give voice in important educational decisions to teachers and other school workers, to families, students, and communities. Teachers and other school workers have the right to bargain collectively. Families have the right to their own organization and to represent their interests and perspectives. Public schools are evaluated on a common set of performance metrics which assess their success at achieving the central purposes and mission of public education. Public schools are centers of community life with organic relations to the neighborhood and communities they serve. Public schools educate for democratic citizenship, cultivating critical thinking, analytical reasoning, and problem solving, promoting historical understanding and the understanding of different perspectives, and engaging students in participation. This was it. This was like we had 8 points here. And please understand that these were drafted primarily from the point of view of someone from labor, and with the full knowledge that traditional public schools were far from the mark. This was not finger pointing at charters. This was finger pointing at everyone. These we thought were principles that if we could all agree to, we could come to a greater sense of what we were doing and the public education wars. So one important note and an epilogue. The note is that we did not reach an agreement regarding a principle having to do with choice, although I do believe that an agreement, especially now, right now, is possible. Choice is still somewhat weaponized out there. And the epilogue is that this work was ultimately abandoned in the summer of 2019 as the Democratic primary for the presidency race began to shape up. It was abandoned because the pull from maximalists on both sides was too strong. It was abandoned because on one side, a bunch of self-styled progressives, seeing the ascendance of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, thought that they had charters on the ropes. After all, why compromise when you can annihilate? And on the other side, it was abandoned for the same reason that the National Alliance had to rescind their invitation to Randi Weingarten to speak at their conference. And by the way, I really want to congratulate the Alliance on having taken that bold move, and I hope that they are not dissuaded from trying it again. After all, Randi is on the list of considerations for Secretary of Education. Probably an outside chance. I've stopped handicapping these things. But if she is, if she were to be selected, do you know that would mean that we actually had a secretary who sits on a charter school board? Yes, it's true, folks. Look it up. University Prep Charter High School in the Bronx. Randi Weingarten is on their board. Which is another way of saying that this particular fight about who gets to run schools is way complicated beyond the good guys and the bad guys. So this initiative to find common ground among all folks struggling in the public education arena has a chance right now, as the ugliest presidency of our lifetime starts to wind down. And as the entire world, especially the world of education, has been flipped upside down by COVID and contemptuous government, we've got to make peace with others who deeply care about schools and who share almost all of our goals, but may be skeptical about our means. Because it can't just be about the state of the charter sector and how big we're going to grow it. It's got to be about saving democracy. Because what we're witnessing should not be considered a one-off event. As Michelle Goldberg said, a country that can elect a Trump can elect another one. Without a doubt, the charter movement has been the single biggest game changer in education over the past 3 decades. And it still holds the promise for creating the kind of schools that could actually get us out of the rut that we're in and move all of education towards the teaching of democratic habits of mind. Thank you, Debbie. But here are some specific things that we need to do. We need to engage with labor. Yes, many of us have fought tooth and nail, many of them have fought tooth and nail against our movement. But the enmity that has grown between labor and charter advocates has got to end, and many among their ranks, especially the visionaries among their ranks, and there are many, know this. As a movement, we have to return to our roots. Chartering needs to empower educators and needs to strengthen the bonds between schools and communities. We cannot support vouchers, period. Public money goes to public schools. We must demand an accountability that is in keeping with 21st century realities, and we need to create it. Equity and strengthening democracy need to be at the top. Teaching is a prestigious profession. We have sent enough young people off to careers in finance and real estate. Let's restore some glamour, and let's remember Sir Ken Robinson and bring joy and laughter into this work. Let's get rid of the profiteers in the charter world. They've brought us nothing but scandals and bad karma. Let's teach and practice democratic values in every class. Today, the President of the United States, this is November 19th, 2020, the President has invited lawmakers from Michigan to the White House so that he can try to overturn an election. So just step back and think about the trajectory of this country over the past 4 years and where we are today with regards to a society that can even embrace objective phenomena and then try to answer the question, what did a nation at risk, that 1983 Reagan-era report that set the stage for education reform movement, miss? Is the risk really that Johnny can't read? What has all our ed reform struggle brought? It's never time to give up the fight for kids and families, especially those that have been marginalized, disenfranchised, and beset by challenges that are not of their own making. But it's time to stop fighting with those who should be our allies. And the way to do this is to find that common ground and to build from it. So I'm not sure that I got the title of my piece right. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs, I just ripped that right off from Kipling. If it was a poem that my dad made me memorize when I was 9 years old, and I'd just thrown a tantrum because my sister broke one of my model airplanes. Those are hard words to live up to, because I don't think I've ever seen so many of my countrymen and women as fully separated from their heads right now as they are. It's an unpleasant sight. But right now I want to leave you on a note of optimism from Debbie Meyer. I asked her how she was able to be so damn chipper, isolated by COVID, in her little house up in the Hudson Valley with the U.S. descending somewhere down into Dante's Inferno. And she said, well, I choose to be optimistic because really, what's the point of choosing anything else? And that made me feel so much better. And I hope that works for you too.